Hey everyone, I'm Jordan Jones, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. This week, we have a special episode planned. We want to look at 1 Samuel 28 and the story of Saul and the so-called Witch of Endor. Now, you may not be surprised by this. After all, it's right before Halloween, and we're turning to one of the most Halloween stories in the Hebrew Bible. This preserved biblical tradition of King Saul visiting a necromancer to talk to the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. What's this story doing in the Bible? What does it say about necromancy? And what are we supposed to make of it? So settle in as we look behind the text of this story about necromancy to see what's really going on in 1 Samuel 28.
Hey, I'm Bob Cargill, and welcome to Bible and Archaeology Podcast. I'm here with Jordan Jones, and I'd like to introduce our new participant, Mary Kate Lichty. She is an undergrad major here in ancient civilization at the University of Iowa.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks. Mary Kate, welcome, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you here. And today we are going to be talking about a very popular topic, a very controversial topic, and something that a lot of people don't know basically why it's in the Bible. This is a strange and odd thing to have in the Bible, and that is the Witch of Endor. Now, this isn't the Endor moon with the Ewoks. This is actually Endor in the Hebrew Bible, and we want to be talking about that. So before we get started, let's have Jordan run us down. What are we talking about here with the Witch of Endor?
I think this is an important framing moment because a lot of people will not have heard this story. This is a story that if you're going to Sunday school, usually doesn't get read.
Right.
This isn't one that you're going to hear from the pulpit. It comes in 1 Samuel 28 near the end of Saul's reign and is the capstone, I would say, of his fall from grace. And so Saul, in a panic before a battle with the Philistines, is trying to hear from God, and God apparently is not answering Saul. And so Saul goes to a woman that has been called the witch, and the title there is something we'll talk about later is that a fair or unfair title?
Right.
And she manages, as a necromancer, to successfully summon the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel so that Saul can ask Samuel some questions about what he should do. Samuel shows up, Samuel speaks, Samuel gives advice, and then the story wraps it and we go on our way. So we want to spend some time looking through, some of these questions of why is this story here? And then some of these interpretation questions that may feel like small things like do we use the title witch or necromancer, but can be a really big difference.
Sure.
And part of obviously why we're doing this at Halloween, because this is the biblical story of necromancy. This is the story of necromancy that we have in the Hebrew Bible, and it works.
That's the big issue.
It works.
It's not just that it's there, that somebody attempts to summon somebody from the dead, bring them back so that they can have a conversation. We've seen countless movies about this. But it works.
Yeah.
It works.
It's not a story of Saul, like in desperation, trying to do something and it failing horribly and a sign like, oh, see, Saul, everything's falling apart. No. Saul wants to do it. Saul does it. She can do it.
No, it's possible. It works.
Yeah, no, it happens.
And an important note, there's no condemnation of necromancy as being like, it's a thing you shouldn't do. But there's no condemnation of its ability to work in the text. It's just maybe identified as a means we shouldn't use, which is something we'll come back to later. But I think let's start with one of the first questions. As our story opens up, we're told that Saul has removed all the mediums and necromancers from the land, much to his mistake, because then he turns around and says, hey, I need one of these. And he turns to his courtiers and says, find me a woman who's a necromancer. And they say, Oh, yeah, no problem. We know where one is.
Yeah, we've got that right away. She's in Endor.
Which tells us something about popular religion versus official religion. And I know we talk about this a lot on the channel, but there's a difference between official religion and popular religion, whether it's Hezekiah's reforms or Josiah's reforms. There's, you only worship one God. You will only worship here in Jerusalem. And then there's what's actually going on, which is why you have all of these prophets running around saying, please, please stop worshiping Baal and Asherah. It's because what's going on in the popular folk religion isn't always what's being dictated from on high. And so he says, no more mediums, no more, necromancers, no more witches. and he says, okay, now I need one. And they're like, oh yeah,
we've got one stashed away.
We've been hiding one from you over here.
We have one ready. And there's an important note here too, I think, that some people make a big deal of, he asks for not just anyone, but a woman to do this, which looking towards the popular versus state religion is one of these points of demarcation potentially as far as who's in charge of this type of practice. Because we're going to see they go to her house. So this becomes one of those elements of, is this household religion? And if this is household religion, is this the place of the matriarch, the mother, the woman of the house to be in charge? But then the king, part of that state religion is now coming over. And so we have this power dynamic.
I also think it's important to note that she's the one doing the action. They're seeking out a woman.
They are. And then the question is, again, if you go all the way through the Salem witch trials, all the way up into modern time, is she the one doing this necromancy, this illicit conjuring of the dead, because that's the only ones that are allowed to do it, right? This is a task that, for better or for worse, or unfortunately, falls to the women because the men are off doing something else? Or is it because the women are the only ones with the power to do it?
When we don't get a ton of answer. And this is one of those moments in this story where it's not a guidebook of how to do this. Right. We're going to see some elements of this that kind of, through the narrative, accidentally give you some frameworks, like when do you do this? Right. And maybe some of the ritual practices you do. But we're not given that fully fleshed out answer. And this is why she was doing this. And this is, they're not interested in laying those elements out. But yeah, they know that she exists. Right. They say, let's get together and let's go over there. And so Saul gets himself into a disguise. Right. And makes his way over.
Well, it's Halloween.
Has to.
It's Halloween. It's Halloween.
Yeah, it's Halloween. He has to dress up, go trick-or-treating.
Yeah.
Well, and this is one of the moments I think is another one of the questions where the disguise element, if we're trying to find pieces that are indicative of how you did this, some people look at the disguise as, on the one hand, he's the king who's supposed to have outlawed this stuff. Is he in disguise to hide his identity? Or is he in disguise because this is a part of the cult practice, much like he fasts, which we find out near the end that he'd been fasting all day? Is the disguise, is the dressing up here a part of the behavior that's required?
I mean, considering that as well, we also have to understand that it's happening at night. And that's an important part of the practice as well.
It's happening at night, yes.
Well, that's when you go trick-or-treating.
Yes.
But it is worth looking at, because the assumption is that you go at night so that hopefully nobody sees you breaking your own dictate, your own mandate. So he's outlawed these guys and now he wants to go visit one. All right, so let's sneak around at night. Let's put on a disguise. So the initial assumption is that he's violating his own laws, so he can't get caught doing that. So he's going to sneak around at night. But the greater question is, what a lot of scholars are asking is, maybe this is part of the ritual.
Yes.
Maybe you can't conjure the dead unless it's at night and you're wearing the proper attire that goes with part of this ritual, part of the process of doing this. And then the question is, you'd have to look at where else necromancy was practiced, and not just in the Hebrew tradition, right? Because you're not supposed to do that, but maybe there are some other places where this was practiced.
Oh, this seems like a Jordan question.
Well, this is, again, a part of the difficulty of this story, especially when we're looking at the term that gets used for her, this Ov, that she is connected with, that scholars don't really know what to do with this. Right. Is this the ancestral spirit? Is this the thing that you use to summon the spirit? What do we do here? I think that the night, it feels like it's simplistic to just make it be one or the other. Right. That on the one hand, it is a great narrative setting. It adds drama. It's the spooky time. It's when you go to talk to the dead. It's maybe when the spirits are most active. But it also feels too richly cultic with the nighttime and the dress and the element we're going to get with fasting, that all of these pieces come together to serve a greater narrative purpose of the point of night, because it asks the question of, like, does the time of night matter for the broader thing? Does it matter only for the narrative, or does it matter for the success? Because it works. Right. So is he a successful cultic petitioner here because he's checked all of the boxes?
Again, we have to remember that there's history. There's things that actually happen and things that don't happen based upon the principles of physics, in nature. And then there's the story. There's the world, the environment that is created by the literature, by the story. And when we are talking about the literature, the story, the environment in which this narrative is set, we can then compare that narrative with other narratives. So the Greco-Roman, the Greek mythology, you can look at Norse mythology, you can look at, but especially the mythology with which they would have been familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So what mythology would from the 10th century, let's say, if we want to go that early, all the way down to the 4th century BC, what mythology in that Eastern Mediterranean region would they have been familiar with? And what are the necromancy practices there? That's, I think, the question that we need to be looking at. Just put that in the back of your head, because if it's just you got to go at night and disguise yourself, okay, that's one thing. But if putting on certain dress, going at night, maybe there's some other aspects that we can glean from the text that suggest that maybe he's following something that we see in Greek mythology that goes along with this. Maybe we're like, oh, maybe they're following these practices as well. What do you think?
Well, I read this great paper by someone named Jordan Jones on this very topic.
Yeah.
What did this person? I don't think I know this one.
You don't know this
you're not
one?
familiar with
No.
this paper? I
Wow.
got to assign more papers to you all.
Oh, no. Well, you argue in your paper, this mirrors the Nicaea and the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Yeah, explain, what is the Nicaea and the Odyssey?
It's, you can probably explain it better than I can.
Well, so this is in the story of the Odyssey.
Right.
This tradition that Odysseus on his way back needs some advice. Much like Saul, he's in a place of confusion. He doesn't know what to do. So what do you do when you're confused? You go to talk to the people that are smarter than you, the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so Odysseus makes a journey into the nightshade realm, essentially, and goes to speak to the dead, ends up speaking to many people, but among them the prophet Tiresias,
Mm-hmm.
who gives him advice of how you're going to get home and what the outcome of this is going to be.
Right.
I think, in this paper I say,
Right.
that I think there's an intentional inversion of that narrative here with Saul.
Right.
Because it follows the same narrative points, the importance of night, the importance of some of the activities that you do, the fasting, but also then in the outcome of this, you get this nice inversion of all the things that are going to go well for Odysseus that Tiresias tells him.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel tells Saul are going to be the opposite.
Yeah.
Oh,
You're not going to be home with your children. You and
Right.
your children are going to die. All the things that are going to go good get inverted. And the woman here is an important part of this too, because in the Odyssey, Odysseus is the one doing the summoning himself. And here Saul is forced to be the petitioner. He doesn't have the cultic control. He has to
Right.
go to someone else.
You
to do
can't even
this.
see Samuel. I think that's an important aspect as well.
Yeah, he's asking, what do you see? And
What do you see?
Yeah, and what she says that she sees is interesting. We'll come to that.
Yes.
But the fact that she summons up Samuel as someone who is supposed to be the one who speaks on behalf of God, right, who has in the Hebrew Bible, and that he gives this horrible declaration to Saul. Basically, everything that I said and on behalf of God, everything that God said, you're going to lose everything. I'm taking my spirit from you. I'm giving it to another. All of it is still confirmed.
Mhm.
You woke me up to tell you again everything that it's God has not changed his mind. It's happening again. Whereas in the Odyssey, you have this idea where Tiresias, who was his friend, right? He brings him back and he says, it's going to be okay.
It's going to be okay. You're going to make it home.
Right.
You're going to have this reunion. Things will end up working out.
Right.
Saul's
No.
outcome of this is the opposite. But it's also not because he does this.
Right.
Samuel doesn't tell him, because you have summoned me, God has. It's what you already did with
Right.
the Amalekites.
Well, can Samuel condemn it when he's being raised? He's aware of the
Well-
practice. Can Samuel condemn that at all?
This is an interesting thing. Samuel doesn't come up and say, why are you doing this? This is an illegal practice. You yourself has condemned it. You know God condemns this. It works.
He
First-
says, why are you bothering me?
Yeah,
yeah,
He
he's
says,
like,
leave me alone.
I'm trying to sleep, man.
Yes.
And he's coming up and he's like, remember, Ken, he's still wearing the stuff that he
Yeah.
died in,
He
right?
has his distinguishing
Correct.
objects on. He's got the cloak because that's how she identifies him.
Right.
She says, I see an Elohim,
Yeah,
Yes.
here we go.
which your Bibles may translate differently. Sometimes they translate it as God. Many times they
let's
just
look at
It's
translate
this.
usually
it as
divine
spirit.
being
or divine
Yeah,
being.
well, it's
spirit.
because people want to sell Bibles.
But she
Yes.
says, I see an Elohim coming out. And then Saul asks for okay, describe this figure to me. And
Yeah.
she gives him the description of the cloak, and he goes, oh, I know this is Samuel.
Yeah, the NRSV says, I see a divine being,
Yeah.
which, isn't
Is-
necessarily a bad translation, but the word is Elohim. And people
Yeah.
need to know that the word here is the word for God. It's Elohim is also used for God or gods. So what he's saying is, I see a God coming up out of the ground. She doesn't know how to describe this. I'm calling up this thing and it looks like it's some kind of,
It's something.
it's a divine being. He's got this, oh my God. And it's Samuel. What I find interesting is as soon as she comes up, I see a divine being and he says, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man coming up. He's wrapped in a robe. So Saul knew that it was Samuel and he bowed to the ground.
Mhm.
And Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me, bringing me up? Right. And he goes, I'm in distress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he starts questioning him. But she says, I see a deity, a god, something. And so the question is it a god? Is it this word appears to describe otherworldly beings
Yes.
elsewhere, which is why I think it's okay to call it a divine being, right? They just had this word God for other gods, which goes back to this thing of, is it truly monotheistic
Or,
or is this just a general word they use for otherworldly beings?
because if you see a thing coming up out of the ground, it's not a human. What terms do you have for this? We talked about this with Dr. Miller,
Yeah.
that what terms do we use for demons or spirits, that sometimes things are inconsistent. So calling this an Elohim might just be your kind of general catch-all of it's not a human, but it's a spirit thing.
But I find interesting, though, is she's a necromancer. This is a practice she does. And she's still surprised
Yeah.
by seeing an Elohim
Right.
as Samuel coming out of the ground.
I think back to some of those movies where they have like what was it, Whoopi Goldberg? Was it Ghost or whatever?
Yeah,
where
I
she's
think so.
pretending, she's
Yes.
got this ruse and she's always trying to summon people from the dead. And then when she really does it, she's like,
It's
oh.
And this is a point some people jump on, that maybe
Right.
she had been a con, that her surprise here might be indicative of, well, this practice isn't really legitimate.
Right,
But in this case,
right,
God saw fit to send Samuel to condemn Saul. And so
Right.
normally the practice is a fraud. But in this case, something different has happened. And we see that in her shock. I don't really buy that.
no,
I
think
don't buy that
feels
either.
fake.
because in the narrative world, this is
Yes.
a practice that happened.
Yes.
The reason we know that is they banned it.
And we have multiple examples of
Yeah.
them saying, don't do this. We get this in other texts like Leviticus, we have Leviticus 19, don't turn to mediums or wizards. Deuteronomy 18, no one shall be found among you who practices divination.
Mhm.
Isaiah, don't consult the ghosts or familiar spirits.
Right.
So we have multiple places where they're condemning, again, don't go and do this thing. As you always say, if you see a sign, no skateboarding, no skateboarding, no
Right.
skateboarding. Don't go and do this. In those moments, they don't say, don't try to do this, because they can't actually access things like they do with idols later, where they say, these are
Correct.
false. They say, don't do this. No one among you should do this.
Right. And keep in mind, it's not because they didn't think the practice didn't work. It's they didn't want anybody else doing it. They did practice divination, but only the high priest was supposed to do it with the Urim and the Thummim, right? They're only the high priest, because how else do you divine the will of God? You have to flip a coin, basically. You have to roll the dice, draw lots, whatever it is. We don't want any idols, except for our idol, except for the
ours.
Ark of the Covenant, right?
Because
That's the only
ours
one.
is
But
good and
no-
yours is bad.
Correct. So it's not that the practices didn't work. It's just that only we do it. We only want our oracle. Only our prophets speak for God, not the false prophets, right? So it's one of these things. I think that this practice, again, do I think it really works in real life? No, I'm not a believer in necromancy.
You've never played a Ouija board?
No, I have, but I know how they
You
work.
didn't get
right?
Samuel?
No, I push it to the letters. It's what we do, right? It's how do you want to go on a date with me? Yes. Why? And somebody else is pushing just as hard towards the no, right? It's this game that we all play. But I think in the narrative setting, of course this happens. Of course it happens.
And I think where is it? In verse 6, that it says, when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Saul had been going through the litany of
this was the last.
Yeah.
What are my means of accessing divine knowledge?
That's right.
Here's my approved list.
Right.
I've gone through them. God's not answering me until I go to the necromancer. And again, it works. So this is maybe not on the approved list, but if the approved things aren't working, it's a means that I know might be available, and here it's successful.
And for anybody who's a parent out there, you know this practice, right? You tell your kids, no, we're not doing that. And then they'll go say, Dad, and you just ignore it. And then they'll say, hey, they'll start bargaining and negotiating, and you just ignore it. And then they do something way over the line. They start slamming doors or whatever. And then it's like, all right, that's it. I'm going to go up there one more time and I'm going to tell you absolutely no. And that's what's going on. God took his spirit from Saul, right? And he said, that's it. I'm giving it to David or someone else, right? And you're done. And now Saul's, Dad, or God, right? Please. And then now he's going to go to the medium, and God's basically going to send Samuel up and say, I said no. And that's it. That's the end of this thing. And Saul's realizing, crap.
Yeah.
Crap.
It's really over. And a term we've been dancing around is her title.
Yeah.
Which I think is, as we're framing this of, he's going to the different means. She normally gets called a witch.
Yeah.
She gets identified as the Witch of Endor, the Witch of Endor. It doesn't use that name. The Hebrew itself never calls her a witch, but she's the Balat Ov. She's like the possessor of, or the master of this thing. So do we want to call her a witch? She has been. She's frequently identified as that. Is she more properly understood as a necromancer? Or should she be identified in what is translated in a much more messy way, but like as the possessor of this ritual object that allows you to speak to spirits? That doesn't go in a line well.
Right.
But what do we feel like best represents her and her power and her standing in this narrative?
I wouldn't call her a witch at all, because I feel like that uses the modern terminology and what we understand today as a witch, as a sorceress, someone who's casting spells. Yes, medium, because the contact with the dead, but our modern conception of witch would not fit into her role, in my opinion.
What is an oath? This is the big question.
Shoulder shrugs.
Yeah, and the place that I always want to go to is the idea of a shaman. So because the other word that comes next to it is, so if you have an ov, and that gets translated as a medium or something, but you also have this word for wizard, right? It gets translated as wizard or necromancer, which comes from the root yada, right? To know. So
the knowers.
These are the knowers, right? And so who are the repositories of wisdom? Not just history, like a chronicler, but that illicit wisdom, that stuff that you're not supposed to know, right? And these are the shaman, right? A tribe or a group. These are the people that know the things that we tell, the history of our tribe, but also the stuff that, this is the dark side of the force.
Yes,
right? The stuff that you're not supposed to know, right? And they know how to, in tradition, to contact the dead, or to contact the ancestors, or to heal, right? Because this all goes together. So I like the idea of a shaman, right? That basically knows how to communicate with the dead, or is believed to be able to communicate with the dead, because then you get the idea of a medium, somebody who stands in between.
Yeah.
Now, you can think of this as a priest, right? Or you can think of this as an intermediary you go to this person, you ask them for advice, you ask them, can you talk to an ancestor? Can you talk to God? So medium is the best word, not a witch, some kind of shaman, some kind of person who knows.
Well, no.
And she's not a priest. Well, one, because she's a woman.
Yeah.
So
Correct,
that is a disbarring place. She's in her home. They're coming to her in her home, where she apparently has this ov. And so she is the possessor of this, which I think is one of those, how is it describing her power in this setup? The king is coming to you and asking you to do a thing. You're the one with control of this situation, of the space, of the thing that channels the spirit. she has the power in this encounter
Right.
Oh,
until Samuel shows up. And then she kind of drifts away, which is one of the moments where, well, how is Samuel present?
Right.
She says, I see him coming up. And then Samuel starts to talk. Is Samuel physically present and speaking? Is Samuel speaking through her? Is Samuel speaking? The
point.
Ove is sometimes identified with a pot that gets put in the ground that is the channel, like a speaking port. Is it just speaking out of that? We don't
Right.
really, again, get the full description because they
Right.
don't want you to know how this works.
Oh,
Right,
no.
right.
So we don't get the full description. But she drifts away while Samuel is speaking. And then when Saul faints at the end, she's suddenly back on the stage.
Right. Right. You're describing the Ove as an object,
Yes.
as like a, and we see this a lot with shaman, or with those who are, I don't want to call them scrying, but with people who are trying to read the divine realm.
Mhm.
They're trying to, whether they're looking into the hat to read the
golden plates?
Yeah.
No, it's not just the plate, but those objects that you put in the stones or whatever you're putting in there, or there's all different ways of, rolling the bones or rolling the dice or whatever it is. But this has gone on for ages, the Urim and the Thummim,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
however that worked, these are ways of doing divination. And so if you're the Lord of that, some kind of oracle, they're going to her. We know from the Hebrew Bible that there were household priests. They're described elsewhere. Sometimes they're very strongly recruited by others, and then they're taken up to become priests of the north, let's say, or tribes in the north. So this is all not far-fetched. This is all right, normal stuff that we would expect in the Hebrew Bible. But the fact that she's able to pull this off, the fact that Samuel comes up, basically condemns Saul again. And then I'm recalling back to Tiresias, the way that Odysseus is able to do this is he digs a hole in the ground.
He digs a hole.
Mhm.
And then I think there's some blood
There's
involved.
a blood sacrifice that happens because the spirits come to drink the blood.
Right. There's a blood sacrifice. They're attracted to it. And then after he talks to Tiresias, I think the other ones want to come up, and the other spirits under, and he's got to shoo
He's
him
got to
away
kind
with
of
a
fight his
sword.
way off, which is,
Right.
again, one of these inversions of Odysseus. It's a hero's journey for him. You're
Right.
going towards the realm of the dead. You speak to the dead and you make it back alive. For
Right.
him, it's a hero's trip.
Oh,
For Saul, it's the
No.
opposite.
Right.
You're weak.
They're
You're
inverting
going
it.
to the medium to do this for you. She is the one summoning. There's a pit that it comes out, but you haven't done anything. He's passive.
Right.
Saul is passive through the entire narrative, and it's portraying him as the weak and the fallen one, which,
Mhm.
if you know the story of Odysseus, it heightens, I think, the collapse that we see of Saul here
Yeah.
of, yes, this works,
Mhm.
but are you a hero? Are you the warrior king that we first had? Why does Saul become king in the first place? Well, he's really tall and he's good at fighting, maybe.
Right.
And now he's in the opposite place. He sees the Philistine army and he gets scared.
And
And
this is the only time in the Hebrew Bible we hear of a king being scared of another army.
Yeah, he's flying away from it when
Yeah.
that's what made him.
That's
And-
what you're there for that.
And the Bible does this quite often, right? How was the world created? It was God bringing order to this chaotic water. How does he undo this? He floods the thing and destroys the earth. He undoes it the way he does it. So the Bible is not beyond taking a story that it's familiar with, a hero story, and flipping it on its head and undoing it in order to destroy
Yeah.
the king. It's not beyond doing that.
Well, I feel like we're dancing around the narrative now of what this is setting up.
Okay.
What's it really about?
This is about King David. This isn't about Saul. It is in the sense that it's his demise,
Mhm.
but it's the perfect stage for David. We've seen Saul do all the things you're not supposed to do over and over again, but this is the final straw.
Mm-hmm.
And this is practicing some type of ritual that he shouldn't be practicing,
Right.
but God's not helping him. So he's got a last resort, and this is his final demise.
Yeah. This is the end of Saul, and the Bible's just kind of punctuating that.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just God. It's telling him. It's now Samuel coming back from the dead, basically to say, "Yeah, you're done."
Yeah, we
Yeah.
lost Samuel, and
Yeah.
now he's back for the
Right.
final word.
Right.
Well, David bookends this story. It starts with David being with the Philistines, and the king of the Philistines saying, hey, you're going to come fight with me. And David goes, you know what I can do. And he says, fine, you'll be my bodyguard. So again, David's with the enemies of Israel here, but they're going to be apologetic about it.
Right.
And then when the narrative ends, Samuel's prophecy is that everything is going to fall apart for you and that it's going to go right. Your son shall be with me. The Lord will give the army into the hands of the Philistines. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David. So David is, in the first big part, set up as, yes, with the Philistines, but he's not fighting. He's not around when Saul dies. And then at the end, it's the apologetic of, yes, remember, David's going to be king because God wants him to. And sandwiched in between is this pinnacle fall from grace for Saul.
What does this tell us about the realm of the dead? Because, I mean, there's, I've always, when in the Hebrew Bible, when you die, you die. You die, you're dead, and you live on through your children, right? Abraham's never promised eternal life in heaven, right? He's promised, I'll make your name great. I'll give you all these kids, right? You're going to live, when you're dead, you're dead. And now we see this concept, we call it Sheol, or you can call it. So when it's a place where everybody goes, all the way down through Ecclesiastes, you get this, right? Through Kohelet. It's the righteous and the wicked. They all go to the same place. They all go to this, call it an underworld, but everybody. And then the question is, are you annihilated? Do you just cease to be? Or are you still kind of an entity? Right. This is my colleague Matt Suriano at Maryland. Still, writes a lot about this. Are you still I don't want to say living? You're dead, but are you still an entity?
How dead is dead?
Yeah. How dead are you? Right.
Not quite dead. This is like Princess Bride when he squeezes on him and says, "He's not dead yet."
Well, I was
not
thinking,
fully dead.
I was thinking,
Monty Python.
Monty Python.
Yeah.
I'm not dead yet.
Samuel apparently isn't fully dead yet.
Well, I feel like from my understanding of Sheol, we get like just an existence, a dark, shadowy existence. But to the extent of death, I don't have an answer for that.
That's Pindar describing Hades, right? It's like it's
a slow evolution.
It's
well, the evolution of the afterlife,
and of course, just so that everyone is familiar, the evolution of whatever we want to call it, Sheol. Hades gets adopted into the Jewish tradition, right? So Tartarus and all of these things end up coming. Where Tartarus as a verb comes into the New Testament, right? To be thrown into hell. So all of this concept of Hades and the Greek underworld gets absorbed into the Jewish tradition. And is this a part where we're beginning to see some of this, which makes us ask the second question: when was this story actually written?
And this is one of those debates of, do you want to place it old? And you can turn towards the Homeric narratives as well as how old do we want to say the Odyssey is? Right. Or how comfortable are we at saying they have a knowledge of a version of this story at what point, if you want to read a parallel?
Right.
You see in some of this, the idea that there's a spirit realm that a spirit can be summoned from. Isaiah talks about, don't consult the ghosts and familiar spirits that chirp and mutter. So an idea there in Isaiah that, okay, there is a place for spirits and some kind of talking happening, don't consult them. But Samuel is very fleshed out, which to me makes it feel later, that this is a part of that development later. We're aware of some of these other ideas of the afterlife that are being heightened now. That does this reflect an idea of the afterlife under King Saul, if King Saul reigned, when King Saul reigned, or is this a later thing? But you have the blend, because the Ov looks towards Mesopotamia and some of the traditions there with consulting. So you really have a drawing on many traditions to make what becomes a wonderful narrative.
Right.
It's a beautiful scene, maybe not for him, but for us as readers, becomes a very captivating story.
I think the lack of detail of the practice indicates that it's later. Because I feel like if we were to get more detail, this has been redacted, and it's not a practice that we want to be informed of.
It could be. That could very well be the case. They're not describing how she did it. And Lord knows that in the pseudepigrapha, like in the much later Second Temple Jewish literature, they tend to fill those plot holes. They go in there and they give, now here's what he did specifically, and they lay that out. So this appears to be in that in-between range where they're absorbing and incorporating those stories that they've got from the larger, Greek world, but they're also not late enough where they're going into great details about what they did and how they did it and what the look, how it all, maybe because they don't want people
doing it.
messing around with this stuff. Right.
And those are kind of the two normal views of either
Yeah.
it's late and they don't know how to describe it
Right.
because it's late.
Right.
Or the description's not there because they don't want you to do it. So they're
Yeah.
not going to describe it. Or maybe it's somewhere in between. There's lots of things that could go in there, but there is definitely a gap. We get some glimmers of elements that describe some of, if you want to do this, if you want to be like King Saul and go speak to the dead prophet Samuel, you're going to do it at night and
Right.
you're going to wear a disguise and you're going to fast, which is an element we get coming in later because he faints and he's so weak and she has to revive him because he'd been fasting, we're told. So, we get some of these pieces, but not all of the pieces of how you want to do this yourself.
Right. Right. I mean, I'm always, when people used to go to an Asclepian, right, and they were getting ready to ask the deity Asclepius, the god of healing, to come and heal whatever it is. One of the things you did before that was incubation. You would go, you would fast, you would take a cold bath, you would put on a certain dress,
Yep.
then you would go in a cave underground and sleep, and you had to do certain things to prepare for the deity to come visit you in your dream. And so, how much of this story, as odd as it is, are we reading in these little details that are actually just incorporating these Greek myths?
Yeah.
That they're disguising enough. They're not telling you certain bits because they don't want to. Maybe it's the editors hiding the fact that they're just incorporating Greek mythological aspects of the tradition.
It's possible. But I would ask then at the end, as we're looking back over all of these pieces,
Right.
If a student came to you today after class, Bob, and said, I'm reading this story, it's 1 Samuel 28, it's the Witch of Endor. What's the point? I've got to run to my next class. What's the point of 1 Samuel 28? What do you think you'd tell them?
I would say, look, this is that this was a practice that took place, that shamanism has never gone away. If you're familiar with my other courses, I teach a course, Mythology of Otherworldly Journeys. We spend a lot of time talking about shamanism, how it's not a religious practice, how it pervades every religion, both ancient and modern today. Mm-hmm. It just manifests in different ways. But the idea of an intercessor, an intermediary who helps you to navigate the spiritual world, what is believed to be the spiritual world, and that these people in different ways help bring the living, you and I, into a better, what they would call an understanding of what's going on in the spiritual world. And if you can bring that into harmony, the person feels better. But that person is also the medicine person. It's also the historian. So that these people have always existed. They've always had a role, and they've been promoted, and they've been, pushed away, pushed out of the light throughout history. So that it's there because it was a real practice that took place in ancient Israel. Oddly enough, it works in the Bible.
It works. If you take nothing else from this conversation, necromancy in the Bible works.
Here it is. And why is it preserved? Why is the story still here? Because it's the Hebrew Bible's way of saying God really, really intends to pound home the idea to Saul, you're done. I made you this first king, right? I think, if we go back into how the Bible is redacted, there is a pro-Saul contingency and there's a pro-David contingency. And there's people that love David and there's people that don't like David. There's people that love the monarchy and there's people who don't love the monarchy, the Davidic monarchy. And so this is one of those stories that says God took it away from you, and now Samuel's dead, but just in case you have any questions, we're going to bring Samuel back from the dead just to thump you one more time.
To say it one more time.
Right. We're just
last word in.
Even the underworld thinks you're not going to be king anymore.
Mary Kate, what about you? What do you think you feel like is that main point of the story?
I would agree, the rise of David, and just framing it, because we get Samuel saying so many times, you don't want a king. Kings suck. You don't want a king. And then Saul comes and no one likes him very much. Well, you're right, there is pro-Saul, but not everyone likes him. And we just constantly are getting this setup that David is going to be the king and the king of Israel and the long-lasting king. And this just hammers in that point further through. But what would you think?
I think for me, In addition to those things, if I was to put a different one forward, it's the role of household cult.
Yeah.
That this, like Jeremiah with the cakes for the Queen of Heaven, where there are these spaces where women at home have control over specific cult practices. They're in charge, and the text doesn't condemn them for this. It might try to say, you shouldn't do this, or maybe we're not big fans of this, but at the end of the day, they do it. They defend their right to do it. They're successful at doing it, and the text preserves that memory of there's the institutional religion that happens with the priesthood at these places. But in addition to that, there are these other things that happened that we know about, and here's some of how it took place. But who's in charge of it? She is.
Yeah.
And so that's for me one of the points of like, why don't I like the name as common as it is, the Witch of Endor? It's well, because as you mentioned, it draws on our ideas of witchcraft and ideas of Salem and Halloween, which is why we're talking about this now, because this is when this story is always being searched for.
Right.
Yeah.
But she's not a witch.
Right.
She is the necromancer. She's the one with the power. She's the one in charge.
Right.
And she doesn't get condemned. The Bible is not hammering on her for
Right.
doing this.
No, she never gets any punishment.
And she's passive. And Saul
is the passive one, and she is the one with authority.
She's the one with the power here, the true power.
Yeah.
So if you didn't think you'd get to this point in the Witch of Endor story, the Necromancy of Endor story, we're happy to bring you around there. If you have questions about this that we didn't get to, because I'm sure there are many, and some of them could be parallels or specific things or confusions over words, many ways to be in touch with us. You can leave them down in the comments. You can send us an email at bible-archaeology@uiowa.edu. You can sign up for our Patreon, where you can send us additional questions that we can incorporate into episodes or bring up at future lives. Or if you're watching this when it comes out, the first Friday of every month is a Friday free for all, so you can come and ask your Medium of Endor stories then. So there's many ways to be in touch. We thank you for watching or listening, however you find us. Be sure to like and subscribe or follow on whatever platform. It helps us. It hopefully helps you stay in touch with us. But for today, I think we've sufficiently traipsed around this story for the moment, but it's always one I'm happy to come back to. Bob, thank you for taking the time. Mary Kate, thanks for joining us today for this conversation.
You.
For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Until next week.